We'll talk more about the role of the mother
Okay.
in Camus, especially when we talk about L'étranger and then later in his life. After this, he moves. I mean, he writes plays and
Yeah.
becomes a journalist.
Another important aspect in Camus is his attraction for theater. Camus wanted to be an actor and a stage director, and he started at an early age to create a troupe in Algeria, which was very important to him, even if not totally professional. Before his death, he was nominated as the director of one of the major theater in theater. So he saw himself first as a man of theater. And theater is also something which is an art which leaves nothing behind it. That means once you have done a show, there is nothing to be kept, whereas in painting, in film, you still have the work. In theater, no. You have to deal on the moment, on the notion of presence. That is also important.
Yeah.
He became a journalist, which is also a job dealing with the present moment. He participated, contrary to Sartre, to the resistance, particularly in 1943.
So he moves to Paris at a certain point from Algeria.
Yeah, during the Second World War, at the beginning of the Second World War, and had a very different life. He had a difficult personal life. He married twice. In the first case, he did not have a very strong relationship to his spouse. They did not have any children. Then he married another woman, Francine, with whom he had two children, twin children, a son and a daughter. But very early he was engaged to one of the most famous actress, Maria Casares, who was probably the great love in his life. However, we can also, without being too inquisitive, consider him as a sort of Don Juan. He had a complex sentimental and sexual life, which is also dealing with the present moment.
Sure.
He became very successful at an early age with two of his books, The Myth of Sisyphus, but first The Stranger, L'étranger, which was a big success and continues to be a big success.
Let's talk a little bit about The Stranger. The notion of the mother, the role of the mother in that book is quite interesting. But here's a book I think published during the war, no, which had a huge impact, and still today I think is very much in the curriculum of the baccalauréat. Many of the French students, it's required reading in grade schools in France, so forth. What was it about that book that had such an effect when it was published?
Probably the first item is the style itself, what Roland Barthes would call l'écriture blanche, a sort of neutral, distance style, very simple at the same time and very effective. The narrator, who is also the same person than the main character in the book, speaks from a distance perspective about his own life, like if he could not connect himself to his own life. And curiously enough, the first sentence of the book speaks about the rupture with the mother. Aujourd'hui, maman est morte. Today, mother died. And that starts the story. He enters into the story once he has created a rupture with the body of the mother.
Yes, and of course the famous failure to cry at his mother's funeral, which then later in the book he thinks causes him to be sentenced to death after he's arrested for the murder of an Arab. We want to talk about as well. So it's a very alienated character, this Meursault. He seems to not be very affected either by his mother's death or his relationship with Marie, that there's this kind of indifference that seems to run throughout his way of being in the world. No? And of course, the one question that every French school child is asked about, pourquoi a-t-il tué l'Arabe? Why does Meursault on a beach at a noon hour, early afternoon hours in this blazing sunshine, and why does he kill the Arab in the famous climactic scene of that novel?
First, I should say here that several different interpretations can be presented of this marvelous novel. So please do keep in mind that this is only my own subjective interpretation. I am not certain first that Meursault is totally indifferent to the mother or to Marie. Rather, he tries to distance himself from the mute and silent love of the mother. There is a disconnection in Meursault between the way he uses language, parole, vocabulary, and what he feels in himself, and is unable to put words on his most important personal feeling. He kills the Arab because he feels threatened by the Arab civilization, which is all around him, and he does not really understand him. He does not know how to talk with them, and he sees them as a threat, and he has a reflex de défense, a mechanism of defending himself when he is not really threatened, and he kills the Arab. You can probably see this murder as exemplary of the misunderstanding between the Pieds Noirs, the people from European origin in Algeria, and the native Arab civilization.
Well, let me say that is a possible interpretation, but I'll tell you why I resist it.
Okay.
I resist it because first it gives an explanation.
Yes.
In a psychological or
political
explanation. And in my reading of the book, the whole point of that act is that it's supposed to be gratuitous and that it doesn't have an explanation, that there's some underlying absurdity to it, and that if we were able actually to give an answer as you did, then it would lose this opacity of enigma that I think Camus was very committed to maintaining, no? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with you, and yet at the same time, I maintain my interpretation because I think maybe it's a professional deformation, but I think the role of the interpreter is to provide explanation, and I do agree with you that the text is opaque and there is a confrontation to a gesture which is totally absurd, but at the same time it calls constantly for interpretation. That might explain also part of the success of this book. It is calling for an interpretation. I provide one, knowing that it is only subjective, and I do not take it as an absolute explanation.
Yeah. And, the other reason I would also resist that interpretation that you gave is that it seems to imply that there's this animus, kind of between the French Algerians and the Arab Algerians, whereas so many of the things that Camus said about his attachment to Algeria and his love for the country and what he learned, from the Arab Algerians themselves, would cast out. Now, here's the question: when when you get the question posed to high school children in France, the almost universal reply to why does Meursault kill the Arab is à cause du soleil, because of the sun, which is not really an explanation. But why is it the first answer that comes to the high school person's mind? À cause du soleil.
Because it's written first, because it's written in the text itself. It's because he is blinded by the sun that he reacts in a violent manner. And also because there is here an allusion to La Rochefoucauld's sentence, neither the sun nor death can be directly faced. Ni le soleil ni la mort ne peuvent être regardés directement. And Camus had that in mind when he wrote this passage. So basically these school kids are just repeating what they read in the footnotes of their edition.
Yeah. That's nice. And I reread it, for our little conversation today, that passage, and it struck me that the description on the beach is the sun is so oppressively overhead and hot and brilliant and blinding,